Welcome to Chapter 7 of The Bronze Kings, The Constitutional Crisis. In Chapter 6, we watch truth spread across 17 regions. Scholars decoding Enoch's prophecies. Enhanced humans questioning whether advantages are earned. Baseline humans' understanding of the disadvantages might be artificial. The Enochian order manages what can be contained, documenting what can't be stopped. 15 years of questions accelerating toward conclusions. Some secrets are becoming too heavy to keep. Now, we jump forward 15 years. To 2835 BCE. To the moment when philosophical debates become a constitutional amendment. This is Chapter 7, The Constitutional Crisis. Constitutional Amendment Proposal 7. The vote that could legitimize capability-based citizenship. 163 representatives from 17 regional councils. Enhanced, baseline, hybrid. The proposal, technical councils implement competency-based voting weights. Representatives demonstrate relevant knowledge to participate. Voting weight proportional to demonstrated competence. Neutral language. Optimization framework. But the result? Enhanced advantages become political authority through apparently neutral institutional mechanisms. Enkidu presents the case. 12 deaths occurred because the optimal water system design was delayed by representatives who couldn't understand calculations. That's not partnership serving people. That's partnership killing people to preserve the appearance of equality. Sharur counters. The question isn't whether enhanced humans make better technical decisions. The question is whether better technical decisions justify political hierarchy, making citizenship dependent on biological advantages people didn't earn. Both valid. Both compelling. Both are insufficient to resolve the fundamental tension. Two-thirds supermajority required, 109 of 163 votes. The enhanced coalition needs more than its bloc. In the upper gallery, Methuselah encodes everything. 3 order scribes embed observations in official records. Because when revelation comes. Chapter 7, The Constitutional Crisis. Uruk, Mesopotamia. 2835 BCE, 15 years after Enoch's prophecies began spreading. The partnership council chamber had been designed for harmony. Circular seating arranged so no position dominates. Skylights admitting natural illumination minimized shadows and made subterfuge difficult. Acoustic properties ensure that even quiet voices are carried clearly, preventing debate from fragmenting into whispered conspiracies. Theory meeting practice. Architectural idealism encountering political reality. Chrono stood at the chamber's center, surrounded by 163 representatives from 17 regional councils who had assembled for what everyone understood would be a defining vote: enhanced humans, baseline humans, hybrids. Immortals are positioned throughout as advisors and observers. The founder, Gilgamesh, was absent, too weakened by approaching death to attend the proposal's formal introduction, though his presence would be felt before this ended. 15 years since scholars had begun decoding Enoch's prophecies. 15 years of spreading questions about enhanced origins, about whether watchers were mythology or memory, about whether biological advantages justified political hierarchy. The philosophical debates had remained largely academic, confined to scholarly gatherings and council discussions. Until now. Constitutional Amendment Proposal 7, Kronos announced, his voice carrying the organizational precision of someone who'd spent 55,000 years structuring systems. Modification to voting procedures and technical councils. Presented for debate and vote per partnership constitutional procedures established 51 years ago at founding. He activated the clay tablet, displaying mechanical systems Prometheus had designed, allowing text to be projected large enough for all representatives to read simultaneously. The proposal appeared in cuneiform that had been carefully drafted over months of preparation. Whereas partnership principles require effective governance serving all populations. Whereas certain technical decisions require specific cognitive capabilities for informed participation. Whereas current voting procedures apply equal weight regardless of demonstrated competence. Be it resolved that technical councils shall implement competency-based voting weights, wherein representatives must demonstrate relevant knowledge to participate in domain-specific decisions. Voting weight shall be proportional to demonstrated competence in the relevant technical domain. All populations retain representation, but influence reflects capability. Agricultural, resource distribution, and social policy councils maintain equal voting. Technical engineering, military strategy, and advanced research councils implement weighted procedures. The chamber's silence held a quality of collective breath-holding. Everyone knew this was coming. The enhanced coalition had been building toward it for years, discussions in private gatherings slowly becoming public proposals. But seeing it formalized, presented as a constitutional amendment that could fundamentally alter the partnership's foundations, made abstract philosophy concrete. In the upper gallery where shadows pooled despite Kronos' architectural efforts to eliminate them, Methuselah watched with the particular attention that came from bearing responsibility for truth's preservation. 128 years old. Enhanced human. Enochian order leader who'd inherited an organization his father had built, believing documentation could bridge species better than deception ever had. His hands moved across a quantum-encoded tablet invisible to baseline perception, recording not just the formal proposal but the chamber's texture. How enhanced representatives sat with unconscious confidence born from biological advantage. How baseline delegates positioned themselves defensively, anticipating arguments they'd need to counter. How hybrids occupied liminal spaces between factions, belonging fully to neither, representing populations that existed as living evidence of intervention's consequences. This moment would matter for revelation. When humans eventually learned the complete truth about enhanced origins, about refugees who'd modified genetics, about intervention disguised as inspiration, about 50,000 years of guidance humanity hadn't consented to, they would need to understand this debate. Would need to see that enhanced consolidation wasn't a malicious conspiracy but a logical consequence of biological inequality. That baseline resistance wasn't ignorant stubbornness but legitimate defensive agency against capability-based hierarchy. The order documented everything because revelation required a complete context. Not vindication. Not exoneration. Just truth showing that both sides had valid arguments, that neither faction was villain or hero, that the partnership's difficulty stemmed from trying to maintain equality despite biology's refusal to cooperate. Methuselah encoded Kronos' body language as he presented the amendment. The slight tension in the shoulders suggests even the architect of this proposal harbored doubts. The careful precision of language, showing someone trying to optimize for fairness while acknowledging optimization itself, created the problem. Constitutional amendments became case studies. Debates became documentation. Votes became data points and patterns that revelation would need to understand. Below, Sharur stood to ask his procedural question. Methuselah encoded that too. The baseline merchant's tactical thinking, calculating whether a two-thirds supermajority would make the amendment defeatable, and assessing whether enough representatives could be swayed to preserve constitutional equality. 15 years had passed since Enoch's prophecies had begun spreading. 15 years of questions accelerating toward conclusions. The order had been managing premature exposures, providing context for discoveries, preparing humanity for the eventual revelation that wouldn't come for millennia. But each crisis tested whether preparation was possible, whether documentation was sufficient, whether truth preserved across generations could serve judgment that wouldn't occur in any current generation's lifetime. This vote would be referenced. This debate would be cited. This moment, when the partnership faced a formal challenge to constitutional equality, would become evidence when humans asked how long immortals had known the system was strained. The order would ensure they knew everything. That was the burden and purpose of the covenant. Sharur was first to stand. 63 years old, baseline human, merchant leader whose 3 decades of watching enhanced commercial dominance had taught him exactly what optimization looked like from the disadvantaged side. Procedure question before debate begins: what majority is required for constitutional amendment passage? 2/3 supermajority, Kronos replied. 109 of 163 votes. The partnership constitution can be amended, but amendments require a broad consensus rather than a simple majority. Safeguard against hasty changes. Noted, Sharur said, his expression calculating. 2/3 meant an enhanced coalition needed more than their bloc. Needed some baseline representatives, some hybrids, some immortal support. Possible, but not guaranteed. I yield the floor for debate, Kronos continued, returning to his seat among the immortal advisors. Representatives may speak in order of request, 3 minutes per statement, with provision for longer presentations if the Council grants an extension. Around the chamber's perimeter, 12 scribes prepared to document the debate. Official council record keepers, their tablets visible to all representatives, their role understood as institutional memory preservation. Standard practice. Expected procedure. Nothing remarkable about scribes recording essential votes. 3 of the 12 were Enochian order. Damon sat among the Eastern scribes, his baseline hands moving across clay tablets with practiced efficiency, having documented partnership debates for 33 years since the questioners had dissolved and Enoch had shown him a complete picture. Surface layer, official cuneiform recording of who spoke, what arguments were presented, and how votes were cast. Deeper layer, quantum-encoded observations about body language, faction dynamics, and emotional currents flowing beneath formal debate. Beside him, a one encoded from an enhanced perspective. 47 years of order service meant she documented these arguments across 17 regions. Enhanced frustration was universal. Baseline defensiveness was consistent. Constitutional debates followed patterns that would need to be understood as systemic rather than unique to Mesopotamia. Third order scribe, Tuvalcain, positioning himself among the Western recorders. Metalworker by trade, order member by covenant, documenting how technical expertise arguments got weaponized in political debates. How competency-based voting sounded like optimization but functioned as hierarchy. How biological advantages became political authority through apparently neutral institutional mechanisms. They wrote 2 histories simultaneously. One for immediate council archives. One for a revelation that wouldn't access these records for millennia. Both true. Both necessary. The partnership, serving different audiences with different needs, struggled under the pressure it was designed to withstand, but biology made it challenging to maintain. The scribes wrote. The debate began. The order documented everything. Enkidu stood immediately. 45 years old, enhanced, Gilgamesh's grandson and designated successor. His presence signaled this wasn't a routine administrative proposal, this was political positioning for a vision of partnership that acknowledged biological reality rather than performed equality. This amendment isn't about exclusion, Enkidu began, his voice measured and strategic. It's about honesty. For 50 years, the partnership has operated under the premise that all voices carry equal weight in all contexts. But we've all watched decisions delayed, suboptimal outcomes implemented, people suffering while we pretend cognitive differences don't matter. He gestured to agricultural representatives seated in the Western Quadrant. Agricultural Council? Both enhanced and baseline input are essential. Isa's 50 years of watching seasonal flooding patterns teach him things my calculations can't capture. Mathematical optimization and lived experience both matter. That council maintains equal voting. Then, to the engineering section, but quantum chamber design? Water system pressure calculations? Astronomical prediction modeling? These require processing speeds and pattern recognition that aren't distributed equally across populations. Including input from representatives who can't follow the mathematics doesn't serve the partnership. It serves performance of equality while producing inferior outcomes. Ninlil stood next, an enhanced engineer, 35 years old, whose frustration with partnership constraints had been building with every project in which baseline input had delayed optimal solutions. Last month, the Eastern Water District. Pressure calculations for expansion require complex fluid dynamics. I presented an optimal design. Baseline engineers requested 3 additional days to review calculations they couldn't independently verify. We granted time because partnership requires patience. Her voice carried the edge of someone who'd swallowed frustration for years. During those 3 days, 2 sections of Old Pipe failed. 12 deaths. Because the optimal design was delayed by the requirement that representatives who couldn't understand the calculations had to pretend they could evaluate them. That's not partnership serving people. That's partnership killing people to preserve the appearance of equality. Murmurs spread through baseline representatives. Ninlil had chosen her example carefully, real deaths, clear causation, emotional impact that made abstract philosophy concrete. This isn't about worth, Ishara added, standing from the enhanced mathematics delegation. 34 years old, the scholar who'd spent recent years studying Enoch's astronomical precision, questioning her own origins, wrestling with implications. It's about capability matching responsibility. Baseline humans contribute essential perspectives in domains where lived experience matters. But in domains requiring computational capabilities distributed unequally by biology, weighting votes by competence produces better outcomes for everyone. She projected probability calculations and mathematical models showing efficiency gains from competency-based decision-making. 17% improvement in technical counsel outcomes when decisions are made by representatives capable of processing relevant complexity. Not excluding baseline participation requiring demonstrated competence for consequential authority. Lugal spoke next, enhanced warrior, 28 years old, Chorus Prize student, voice of the military contingent that had been growing increasingly frustrated with partnership constraints on tactical decisions. Military strategy sessions. Combat scenarios require split-second tactical analysis. Current partnership protocol requires consensus from representatives who process threat assessment at a fraction of enhanced speed. He met the baseline representative's eyes directly. You're not inferior humans. You're inferior at combat calculations. That's biology, not an insult. Would you want enhanced warriors delaying your agricultural decisions because we don't understand crop rotation? No. You'd want people with relevant expertise deciding. Why is military strategy different? Because pretending biological advantages don't exist serves political comfort more than combat effectiveness? The enhanced coalition's opening had been coordinated, practiced, strategically constructed real examples, mathematical proof, emotional appeals, acknowledgement of baseline value in appropriate contexts. Not proposing wholesale exclusion, proposing optimization that acknowledged reality rather than enforced equality. Now, baseline defense had to respond. Sharur stood again, and the chamber quieted. 30 years as a merchant leader. 3 decades of eloquence honed through commercial negotiation and political debate. Voice of the population that understood exactly what optimization meant when biology determined capability and capability determined authority. Efficiency without justice is tyranny, Sharur said simply. Let the words settle. Let representatives process the fundamental challenge to the enhanced coalition's logical framework. You present examples where enhanced speed saved lives or baseline delay caused deaths, he continued. Valid examples. Real consequences. But you're asking the wrong question. The question isn't whether enhanced humans make better technical decisions. The question is whether better technical decisions justify a political hierarchy that makes citizenship dependent on biological advantages people didn't earn. He gestured to Lugal. You're correct that enhanced warriors process faster. But military strategy isn't pure mathematics. It's a political act with political consequences. Who lives, who dies, which communities get protected, which risks get accepted. These aren't technical optimizations. They're value judgments disguised as calculations. And value judgments require consent from those accepting consequences, not just the capability to calculate probable outcomes. Aga stood next, baseline scholar, 35 years old, whose development of baseline dignity philosophy had provided an intellectual framework for baseline resistance to enhanced consolidation. Enhanced representatives keep saying capability as if it's a neutral descriptor. But capability is a biological lottery. Ishara didn't earn superior processing through effort. Lugal didn't achieve faster reflexes through training. They were born with advantages that baseline humans can't match through any amount of work. His voice strengthened as he articulated the framework he'd spent years developing. So, asking whether capability should determine authority is asking whether birth circumstances should determine political power. Whether the biological lottery should create a hereditary hierarchy. Whether accidents of genetics should decide who governs and who's governed. That's not optimization. That's aristocracy with extra steps. Democracy isn't about optimal outcomes, Sophia interjected from her immortal advisory positions. The teacher, the philosopher, the one who'd spent millennia believing education could bridge any gap. Democracy is about a legitimate process. Government by consent of the governed. And consent requires participation, not observation. If baseline humans can't meaningfully participate in decisions affecting their lives because cognitive capacity determines voting weight, then government becomes tyranny regardless of how optimal outcomes are. Mira spoke next, baseline engineer, 40 years old, who'd spent her career building systems that prioritized universal access over enhanced optimization. I'm not as fast as Ninlil. Can't run calculations as quickly. But I've designed water systems serving 30,000 people across 6 cities. Every design prioritized accessibility, maintenance that baseline engineers could perform, repairs that didn't require enhanced cognition, systems that served everyone because everyone could understand them. She gestured to Ninlil. Your optimal designs serve enhanced efficiency. My universal designs serve partnership principles. You say my approach is inferior because it's slower. I say your approach is inferior because it creates dependency. Which definition of optimal matters more? Technical efficiency or political sustainability? The debate had been proceeding for 90 minutes, and positions were crystallizing. Enhanced coalition presenting logical arguments grounded in measurable capability differences. Baseline defense presents ethical arguments grounded in democratic legitimacy and consent-based governance. Both sides are making compelling cases. Both sides represent valid philosophical frameworks. Both sides are threatening to fracture the partnership if they win. Davor stood as a hybrid representative, 42 years old, exhausted by 50 years of attempting to bridge populations while being claimed by neither. We hybrids have been watching this debate for decades. Listening to enhanced humans argue for meritocracy. Listening to baseline humans argue for equality. Both sides are talking past each other because you're starting from different premises about what legitimacy means. His voice carried the weariness of someone who'd mediated this conflict so long he'd stopped believing resolution was possible. Enhanced representatives believe capability legitimizes authority. Baseline representatives believe consent legitimizes authority. You're not really debating weighted voting. You're debating a fundamental question about what makes governance legitimate, optimal outcomes or inclusive process. And you'll never resolve that because both answers are correct from their premises. Saduri added from the hybrid section, Sophia's daughter, 50 years old, voice of the population created to bridge, but ended up marginalized by both sides. This amendment isn't really about hybrids. But it will affect us because it establishes a precedent that cognitive capacity determines political authority. We process faster than baseline humans but slower than enhanced. Where do we fit in a competency-weighted system? Perpetually inadequate by enhanced standards, perpetually privileged by baseline standards, never quite belonging to either population. She met Enkidu's eyes. You say this isn't exclusion. But precedent matters. Start with technical councils only and watch definitions expand. Eventually, all consequential decisions become technical. Eventually, baseline humans retain ceremonial participation, while real authority is held by the enhanced. That's not partnership evolution. That's partnership ending through procedural amendment. The morning session concluded with no resolution. Representatives broke into factional clusters, enhanced coalition confident but recognizing they needed more votes, baseline defense worried but determined, hybrids divided and uncertain, immortals split on whether efficiency or ethics mattered more. Gilgamesh watched from his private chamber through messenger reports, too weak to attend but following every word, calculating whether he had authority left to intervene. Whether a dying founder could still bind the living generation to principles they were questioning. The vote was scheduled for 3 weeks hence. Time for negotiation, persuasion, compromise, coercion. Time for a partnership to discover whether institutions could survive when generations disagreed about foundations. The time that would determine whether capability or consent defines legitimate governance. Enkidu's residence, Uruk. Evening, first day of debate. The enhanced coalition's leadership gathered in Enkidu's private quarters as sunset painted Uruk's mud brick buildings amber and gold. 12 representatives, military, commercial, engineering, and academic. All enhanced. All are frustrated by partnership constraints. All believe their proposal served justice despite baseline accusations of tyranny. Enkidu had prepared vote counts on clay tablets, mathematical precision applied to political calculations. Current commitments, 75 solid votes. Enhanced delegation provides 53, accounting for population proportions. 8 hybrid representatives leaning toward our position, they recognize competency. Arguments even as they're conflicted about personal implications. 14 baseline representatives who value efficiency over principle, mostly engineers and military coordinators who've experienced partnership constraints personally. Cassett studied the numbers. Enhanced administrator, 38 years old, whose organizational mind recognized both the logic of their position and the danger of their approach. 75 committed. Need 109 for the constitutional amendment. 34 votes short. That's a significant gap requiring either massive persuasion success or coalition fracture on the baseline side. 3 weeks, Sharur said, a mathematician who calculated probabilities without emotional comfort. 34 votes across 21 debate sessions and countless private negotiations. Need to persuade approximately 2 votes per day from populations already resistant to our arguments. What concessions are we willing to offer? Nilal asked pragmatically. Baseline representatives won't support purely on logic. They need something. Reserved sectors in some councils? Guaranteed baseline representation even in technical domains? Constitutional protections against future amendments expanding weighted voting beyond the initial scope? Enkidu considered strategy, mind trained by Gilgamesh, now applied to defeating principles Gilgamesh had built. We offer sunset provision. The amendment expires after 20 years unless renewed through another constitutional vote. That addresses the baseline concern about a permanent precedent while giving us time to demonstrate that competency-weighted voting produces better outcomes. Evidence-based persuasion. Will they accept temporary implementation? Lugal challenged. Baseline defense is an arguing principle, not practice. They're not saying weighted voting doesn't work, they're saying it's tyranny regardless of efficiency. Sunset provision doesn't address their fundamental objection. Then we address it directly, Enkidu said. We argue that tyranny is forcing people to suffer suboptimal outcomes for philosophical comfort. That true injustice is partnership constraints killing people while we perform equality. We acknowledge their principle and say practice matters more. Durga spoke, enhanced administrator, 40 years old, whose decades of governance experience had taught her that institutions serve people or serve principles but rarely both. That argument won't persuade baseline leadership. Sharur, Aga, Mira, they're committed to consent-based legitimacy. Won't compromise on fundamentals. We need to target moderate baseline representatives. Engineers who've experienced delays. Merchants who've lost commerce to enhanced competition and recognize biological reality. Citizens who value outcomes over process. Personal appeals, Cassett suggested. One-on-one conversations. Share specific examples where partnership constraints produced harm. Emphasize we're not devaluing baseline humans, we're acknowledging that different capabilities serve different functions. Appeal to their practical sense while respecting their dignity. The strategy session lasted 3 hours, vote counting, targeting wavering representatives, preparing counterarguments, and coordinating messaging. The political machinery is operating efficiently because enhanced cognition enables faster planning and better organization. Irony not lost on Enkidu, they were more efficient at politics because of the advantages they were arguing should determine political authority. Grandfather will intervene, Enkidu said as the gathering concluded. Everyone understood which grandfather, which intervention, which authority he meant. He's too weak to attend debate sessions, but he'll make one appearance. Final vote, probably. Use whatever authority he is left to defeat our amendment. Will it work? Someone asked. Probably, Enkidu admitted. He founded a partnership. Built institutions, we're trying to modify. Dying founders carry authority that living generations can't match if he makes an emotional appeal about preserving his legacy, about the partnership surviving him only if we maintain the foundations he established, which will shift votes. Maybe enough to defeat us. So we're planning for failure? We're planning for long-term victory through short-term loss, Enkidu corrected. Grandfather is 172 years old. In Chapter 12, he'll be dead. Partnership institutions survive only if each generation chooses to maintain them. And our generation is questioning whether partnership serves people or constrains capability. The vote might fail now. But consolidation continues regardless. Markets still reward enhanced efficiency. The military still needs enhanced speed. Infrastructure still benefits from enhanced optimization. He looked around at the enhanced leaders who represented the future after Gilgamesh died. We lose this vote, but demonstrate our arguments are sound. We build evidence that competency-weighted decisions produce better outcomes. We position ourselves so that when grandfather dies, and a succession crisis comes, our generation controls the partnership's future direction. This amendment is an opening move in a longer game. That's cold calculus, Cassett observed. That's strategic thinking, Enkidu replied. Grandfather taught me to think long-term. I'm applying his lesson to problems he didn't anticipate. Partnership was necessary 50 years ago when baseline humans needed protection from immortal control. But we're not immortals. We're humans, enhanced, yes, but human. And human governance should reflect human capability rather than immortal guilt about hidden manipulation. The gathering dispersed, understanding that they'd probably lose this vote, but were fighting for a future in which enhanced capability determined authority, without guilt or constraint, where biological advantages naturally led to political hierarchy because reality mattered more than principles designed to prevent reality from mattering. Sharur remained after others departed. I've been studying the Enoch texts more deeply since debate preparation began. Enkidu waited. Sharur's tone suggested she was processing something uncomfortable. If enhanced advantages are artificially created, she said carefully, if we're products of external intervention rather than natural superiority, does that change the legitimacy of our arguments? Does the origin of capability matter when determining whether capability justifies authority? No, Enkidu said immediately. Origin is irrelevant. The present reality is that enhanced humans process information faster, calculate more accurately, and coordinate more efficiently. Whether that came from natural evolution, divine blessing, or external intervention doesn't change the measurable fact of superior capability. We're arguing outcomes, not origins. But Aga's framework depends on whether advantages were earned, Sharur pressed. He's arguing that biological lottery shouldn't determine hierarchy. If our advantages weren't even natural lottery but artificial imposition by external beings, doesn't that strengthen his case that hierarchy based on those advantages lacks moral legitimacy? Only if you accept the premise that legitimacy requires an origin story rather than present capability, Enkidu replied. I don't. Enhanced humans are more capable regardless of how we got that way. Capability produces better outcomes. Better outcomes serve everyone, including baseline populations. That logic holds whether our capabilities are natural, divine, or engineered. Sharur looked unconvinced but not openly challenging. Baseline representatives will use Enoch evidence during debate. Argue that Nephilim created through external intervention shouldn't claim a natural right to rule. We should prepare counterarguments. We already have a counterargument, Enkidu said. Reality doesn't care about origin stories. Markets reward efficiency. The military needs speed. Infrastructure requires optimization. Those needs existed before humans knew where enhanced advantages came from. Will continue existing after everyone agrees. Watchers were real. Philosophical arguments about legitimacy are irrelevant compared to the practical requirements of governance. He walked to the window, looking out over Uruk, where lights were beginning to appear as families settled for the evening. I respect grandfather's principles. But principles that can't prevent suffering aren't worth maintaining. Partnership claims to serve all humans. But it serves political comfort more than actual people. We're offering an honest hierarchy that acknowledges reality. That's more just than performed equality that pretends biology doesn't matter while people die from partnership constraints. Sharur departed, still processing, still questioning, still caught between the enhanced advantages she possessed and the philosophical implications of their origin. Enkidu recognized she might not vote for the amendment despite supporting its logic, personal doubt undermining political calculation. But 75 votes were committed. And 3 weeks remained for persuasion. Sharur's residence, Uruk. Same evening. The baseline defense leadership gathered in Sharur's trading house, where decades of commercial struggle had taught him exactly what enhanced optimization produced for population biology had disadvantaged. 20 representatives, merchants, farmers, craftspeople, scholars. All baseline. All understanding that the weighted voting amendment was an existential threat disguised as a procedural modification. Vote count, Sharur said without preamble. His 63 years of experience as a merchant had taught him to address problems directly. Where do we stand? Aga had been coordinating the defensive strategy, a philosopher-scholar whose baseline dignity framework provided the intellectual foundation for baseline resistance. Solid opposition, 70 votes. Our baseline block provides 63, accounting for population proportions. 7 hybrids leaning against the amendment, they recognize it establishes a precedent that marginalizes them further. No immortals committed to our side yet, but several are indicating philosophical opposition to capability-based hierarchy. 70 against, 75 for, Sharur calculated. 18 representatives are undecided or uncommitted. Need to hold our block and persuade at least 40 from the undecided or enhanced coalition to reach 109 votes blocking the amendment. That's optimistic mathematics. Enhanced coalition is better organized, Mira observed. Engineer, 40 years old, whose career building universal access systems had taught her that optimization and accessibility required different values. They coordinate faster because enhanced cognition enables it. They're already running sophisticated persuasion campaigns targeting our wavering members. We're playing defense against opponents who process faster and plan better. Then we need different advantages, Aga said. We can't outcalculate them. Can't out-organize them. Can't match their coordination speed. But we have something they lack, moral clarity about why capability shouldn't determine citizenship. He spread clay tablets containing his philosophical framework across the table. Enhanced arguments depend on utilitarian logic, better outcomes justify authority. We argue that the democratic principle of consent legitimizes governance regardless of the quality of outcomes. They're appealing to practical efficiency. We appeal to political legitimacy. Those are different value frameworks. Will philosophical arguments persuade representatives worried about practical consequences? Someone challenged. Ninlul's water system example is powerful. 12 deaths were due to the partnership's delay in the optimal design. How do we respond to that without sounding like we value principle over lives? We question the framing, Aga replied. Ninlul presents a false choice, partnership principles or saved lives. But an optimal water system designed by enhanced engineers creates dependency. Baseline engineers can't maintain it. Baseline communities can't modify it. Baseline populations must trust enhanced superiority for essential services. That's not partnership, that's clientelism. Enhanced is a permanent expert class, baseline is permanent dependence. Sharur nodded. Independency creates hierarchy more permanent than any formal law. If baseline humans can't operate infrastructure because it requires enhanced cognition, then baseline humans become subjects regardless of voting rights. Political equality becomes performance when practical reality creates a permanent dependent relationship. So our counterargument is sustainability over optimization? Mira asked. Our counterargument is that a true optimal outcome includes political legitimacy, not just technical efficiency, Aga clarified. A water system that baseline engineers can maintain might be less efficient. But it preserves baseline autonomy and practical capability. That's worth efficiency cost if we value partnership over pure optimization. That's a sophisticated argument, Sharur said. Can we make it simple enough for 3-minute council speeches? Efficiency without justice is tyranny, Aga quoted Sharur's own opening statement. That captures the core principle. We expand by showing how dependency creates tyranny even when tyranny is benevolent. Enhanced optimization producing baseline marginalization. Better outcomes through processes that exclude populations from meaningful participation. The strategic discussion continued through the evening. Baseline defense had fewer representatives, slower coordination, and less sophisticated organization. But they had clarity about the stakes. This amendment threatened the partnership's foundations through procedural modification that established precedent for capability-based citizenship. Gilgamesh will intervene, Sharur said finally. Everyone knew he would. Dying founder's last stand for principles he built. We need to position our arguments so his intervention reinforces rather than replaces our case. He'll carry authority, but authority fades when the founder dies. We need a philosophical framework that survives him. Aga's dignity principle, Mira suggested. Capability doesn't determine worth. Biological advantages don't justify political hierarchy. Governance requires consent, not just optimal outcomes. Those principles transcend Gilgamesh's personal authority. And we connect to Enoch evidence, Aga added. Enhanced advantages might be artificial imposition by external beings. If true, the baseline argument that the biological lottery shouldn't determine hierarchy becomes the baseline argument that external intervention shouldn't determine hierarchy. Stronger case philosophically. Will that persuade wavering baseline representatives? Someone asked. Our target is our own members who value efficiency enough to consider supporting weighted voting. We appeal to dignity, Sharur said. To self-respect. To recognize that accepting inferior citizenship in exchange for better outcomes is surrendering humanity for comfort. Baseline representatives considering the enhanced coalition's logic need to understand they're not voting for efficiency, they're voting to acknowledge their own permanent inadequacy. Harsh framing. Emotionally charged. But an accurate description of what competency-based voting meant for populations' biology had been disadvantaged. The gathering concluded with the understanding that they were fighting a defensive battle against opponents with natural advantages. But they had moral clarity, philosophical coherence, and a dying founder who'd probably use his last authority to preserve the partnership he built. Probably enough to win this vote. Probably not enough to stop consolidation that continued across markets, the military, infrastructure, and every domain where capability determined outcomes, regardless of voting rights. Aga remained after others departed. I've been developing responses to the enhanced coalition's specific arguments. Need your commercial experience to strengthen counterexamples. Sharur gestured to the trading records spread across his work table. 3 decades of documentation showing enhanced merchant dominance, baseline commercial decline, markets systematically rewarding cognitive advantages that partnership institutions couldn't constrain. Every argument enhanced coalition makes about technical councils, I've seen play out in markets, Sharur said. They claim weighted voting acknowledges reality. Markets already acknowledge that reality. They claim that capability should determine authority. Markets already let capability determine outcomes. They claim partnership constraints harm everyone. Markets ignore partnership entirely. He met Aga's eyes with merchants' pragmatism tempered by 30 years of commercial struggle. We'll win this vote. Gilgamesh's intervention will carry enough authority to block a constitutional amendment. But we won't stop consolidation because enhanced arguments about capability determining outcomes are correct, even though their proposed solution is tyranny. Biology creates advantages. Advantages produce outcomes. Outcomes accumulate into a hierarchy. Partnership can protect voting rights, but can't prevent capability from mattering in every practical domain. Then why fight? Aga asked. Because principle matters even when practice fails, Sharur replied. Because maintaining constitutional protection against formal hierarchy preserves space for baseline dignity even when economic reality undermines it. Because voting rights matter even when commerce ignores them. Because refusing to legitimize capability-based citizenship matters even when markets operate as if we already had capability-based citizenship. He stood, old merchant's body protesting movement after a long evening. I'll die in 20 years, maybe less, is the baseline human lifespan. Enkidu will still be vital, still leading the enhanced coalition, still building toward consolidation. My death makes it easier. This vote isn't about stopping him. It's about making him work harder and making consolidation happen through 1,000 small steps rather than one constitutional amendment. Buying time for baseline resistance to develop. Maybe buying time for enhanced humans like Sharur to question whether capability justifies hierarchy. You're not optimistic about long-term, Aga observed. I'm realistic about biology, Sharur corrected. Enhanced humans are superior at everything measurable. That superiority will eventually produce hierarchy regardless of political institutions. But eventually matters. How much time baseline humans have to develop alternative frameworks matters. Whether consolidation happens through constitutional amendment or through gradual economic dominance matters because the process affects whether baseline populations accept hierarchy or resist it. He looked out at Uruk's evening lights. Partnership is dying. The question is whether it dies through baseline consent to enhanced authority or through baseline humans retaining dignity while losing practical power. This vote determines whether we surrender political legitimacy along with economic dominance. That's worth fighting for even when we know markets are making our political victory increasingly hollow. Aga departed with the understanding that they were fighting rearguard action, defending principles that reality was undermining, and preserving constitutional protections that couldn't prevent practical consolidation. But rearguard actions mattered. Bought time. Preserved dignity. Established precedent that capability didn't automatically justify authority even when capability produced better outcomes. Worth fighting for even when losing was inevitable. Gilgamesh's private chamber, Uruk. 5 days after the debate began. Gilgamesh sat alone in darkness, reviewing vote counts by lamplight. 172 years old. Dying by increments. Mind still sharp enough to recognize patterns and calculate political probabilities despite the body failing faster than enhanced longevity should permit. The clay tablets spread across his work surface told a mathematical story. The enhanced coalition held 75 committed votes. Baseline defense held 70. 18 representatives are undecided or wavering. A constitutional amendment required 109 votes, a two-thirds majority. Enhanced coalition needed 34 more votes. Baseline defense needed to hold the current bloc and persuade at least 40 from the undecided to reach the blocking threshold. Close mathematics. Uncertain outcome. Hinging on persuasion, negotiation, emotional appeals, practical considerations, philosophical convictions, and personal relationships. Everything that the partnership had been built on, now tested through constitutional procedure, could fundamentally alter what the partnership meant. Nix entered without knocking. Immortal privilege, comfort born from 50,000 years together, understanding that Gilgamesh needed a probability assessment he couldn't generate himself. "You're calculating whether to intervene," she said, reading his expression with pattern recognition refined across millennia. "Calculating whether intervention works," Gilgamesh corrected. "My authority erodes with my health. Each appearance costs political capital I can't regenerate. If I intervene and fail, I've spent my last influence without effect. If I don't intervene and the amendment passes, I've preserved partnership through 50 years only to watch it end through my silence." Probability assessment? Nix offered. "Please." She projected numbers that her mind had been calculating since the debate began. Current trajectory, amendment passage probability 53%. Enhanced coalition has momentum, better organization, and logical arguments that appeal to practical representatives. Baseline defense has moral clarity but fewer resources for persuasion. Undecided representatives are trending toward an enhanced position because efficiency arguments are compelling when divorced from philosophical implications. If I intervene? Your intervention shifts probabilities to 61% amendment defeat, Nix calculated. But costs you your remaining authority. Subsequent interventions would carry diminished weight. You're spending political capital irreplaceably to shift probabilities by 14%. Gilgamesh processed the mathematics. That assumes my intervention is optimally timed and executed. If I intervene poorly, probabilities shift less. If I intervene too early, the enhanced coalition adapts. If I intervene too late, positions harden beyond persuasion. Optimal intervention point is final vote, Nix confirmed. Maximum emotional impact. Representatives face a moment of choice between the founder's appeal and coalition logic. Your authority functions best as a decisive factor rather than an opening argument. So I wait. Watch negotiations proceed. Prepare intervention for the moment when it matters most. Gilgamesh felt the weight of a strategy that required watching a partnership threaten while preserving authority for a final stand. What happens after this vote, regardless of the outcome? Amendment defeat doesn't stop consolidation, Nix said with the honesty of a probability modeler. Markets continue rewarding enhanced efficiency. The military still needs enhanced speed. Infrastructure continues benefiting from enhanced optimization. Formal political hierarchy is prevented through constitutional protection, but a practical hierarchy emerges through every domain where capability determines outcomes. So this vote determines whether consolidation happens with the partnership's consent or despite the partnership's resistance? Correct. Amendment passage legitimizes a capability-based hierarchy through the constitutional process. Amendment defeat preserves the principle that capability doesn't determine citizenship. But an amendment defeat doesn't prevent the capability from determining practical authority in economics, the military, and infrastructure. Different paths toward a similar destination. Gilgamesh felt the despair of someone who'd built institutions insufficient to prevent patterns he'd spent 50 years trying to constrain. Partnership protected voting rights. It couldn't protect against biological advantages producing outcomes that made voting rights increasingly ceremonial. I'll intervene during the final vote, he decided. Use whatever authority remains to defeat the amendment. Not because defeat stops consolidation. Because refusing to legitimize capability-based citizenship through constitutional process matters even when markets operate as if we'd already established capability-based citizenship. Principle over practice, Nix observed. Principle enabling practice, Gilgamesh corrected. Constitutional protection against formal hierarchy preserves space for baseline dignity even when economic reality undermines it. That space matters. Might enable future generations to address consolidation in ways we haven't imagined. But only if we preserve principle against immediate pressure to acknowledge reality through institutional change. He looked at the vote counts again. Mathematics determine the partnership's future. Enkidu thinks I'm fighting a lost cause. Defending principles that reality contradicts. He's partially correct. But he's young enough to believe reality is permanent. I'm old enough to know institutions shape future possibilities. What we refuse to legitimize now might become possible to prevent later. What we legitimize now becomes the foundation for the future we can't reverse. You're buying time, Nix said. I'm preserving options, Gilgamesh replied. For populations that will face these questions long after I'm dead. That's all founders can do, build institutions flexible enough to accommodate future problems while maintaining principles rigid enough to prevent expedient solutions that foreclose future possibilities. Nix departed, leaving Gilgamesh alone with calculations that his intervention would probably succeed, but wouldn't solve the underlying problem. Enhanced humans were superior at measurable tasks. Superiority produced outcomes. Outcomes are accumulated into a hierarchy. Partnership could protect against formal acknowledgement, but couldn't prevent practical manifestation. Unless something changed that he couldn't predict. Unless baseline humans developed frameworks he hadn't imagined. Unless enhanced humans like Sharur questioned their own advantages enough to voluntarily constrain their capabilities. Unless. Maybe. Possibly. The vocabulary of someone building institutions for futures he wouldn't live to see. He began preparing the intervention he'd make during the final vote. Not relying on authority alone, that was eroding. Not relying on logic alone, the enhanced coalition had that advantage, relying on emotional appeal, moral urgency, personal vulnerability, historical warning, and faith in human capacity to choose justice despite biology. Everything he had left. Spent on preserving principles that he wasn't certain could be preserved. But trying mattered even when success was uncertain. Especially when success was uncertain, that was the burden leadership carried, acting as if outcomes were achievable even when probability calculations suggested otherwise. Sophia's teaching hall, Uruk. 7 days after the debate began. The classroom held 30 students, mixed enhanced and baseline, ages ranging from adolescent to adult, gathered for a philosophy session that Sophia had structured around questions that weren't questions, examinations disguised as education. Governance legitimacy, Sophia began without preamble. Her teaching method after 50,000 years had evolved toward Socratic efficiency, questions that forced thinking rather than lectures that provided answers. Where does it come from? Marduk. Enhanced student, 17. The capability to govern effectively. Government exists to serve people. Serving people requires competence. Competence determines legitimacy. So incompetent government is illegitimate? By definition. Government that can't govern effectively has no justification for authority. In Shakashana. Baseline student, 19. But who determines effectiveness? Enhanced humans will define effective governance as outcomes they're better positioned to achieve. Then, they claim their superiority. Proves their legitimacy. That's circular reasoning. Is it? Sophia pressed. If enhanced humans do achieve better outcomes, does that circularly prove their legitimacy or directly demonstrate it? Marduk responded, better outcomes directly demonstrate legitimacy. Government exists for outcomes. Governance producing better outcomes is better governance. That's not circular, that's definitional. Better for whom? In Shakashana challenged. Enhanced humans achieve outcomes they value by leveraging their capabilities. Maybe baseline humans value different outcomes requiring different capabilities. Who decides which outcomes define better? Sophia watched the debate unfold, guiding without directing, letting students articulate the frameworks political leaders were deploying in council chambers, education as preparation for citizenship, understanding as foundation for choice. Nineshuber. Enhanced student, 20. This is why weighted voting makes sense. If populations value different outcomes, let populations vote on domains where their values apply. Enhanced vote on technical optimization. Baseline vote on social policy. Hybrids mediate. Everyone participates in areas matching their capability. That assumes domains can be separated. Raimush. Baseline student, 22, countered. But technical optimization is social policy. Deciding who maintains infrastructure is deciding who has employment. Deciding military strategy is deciding who lives and dies. You can't separate technical efficiency from political consequences. Then we're back to baseline participation constraining enhanced capability, Enkidu said. Because baseline humans can't process technical complexity, all technical decisions must operate at baseline processing speed. That harms everyone by preventing optimal outcomes. Sophia let silence settle, then asked, is government optimal outcomes or a legitimate process? Both, Marduk said immediately. Legitimate process that produces optimal outcomes. What if they conflict? Sophia pressed. What if optimal outcomes require excluding some populations from meaningful participation? What if a legitimate process includes voices that slow optimization? Which matters more? Enhanced students argued for outcomes. Baseline students argued for process. Both positions are internally consistent. Both positions produce governance systems that contradict each other. Precisely what the Partnership Council was discovering. Historical question, Sophia shifted her approach. Has competence-based exclusion ever led to stable government? Enhanced students referenced Akkadian administrative efficiency. Baseline students referenced the eventual collapse of the Akkadian Empire. Enhanced students argued that correlation wasn't causation. Baseline students argued that concentrated power inevitably corrupted. The debate continued for 2 hours, students articulating with passion and precision the same arguments their representatives were deploying in council chambers. Sophia didn't tell them what to think. She helped them think clearly about what they already believed. But clarity was its own form of persuasion. Enhanced students who clearly articulated why capability justified authority sometimes heard their own arguments and recognized implications they hadn't considered. Baseline students who clearly articulated why consent legitimized governance sometimes recognized their position, which assumed equality, even though biology contradicted it. After class, a private conversation. Enkidu approached Sophia after other students departed. Enhanced student, 20 years old, mathematically brilliant, politically engaged, headed toward a career in partnership administration. That session felt less like education and more like persuasion. All education is persuasion, Sophia replied. I'm teaching you to think. Thinking clearly about weighted voting sometimes reveals implications that weren't obvious before examination. You're opposing the amendment. I'm helping students understand what they're supporting or opposing. Democracy isn't about optimal outcomes. It's about a legitimate process. That's not an anti-enhanced position. That's a democratic principle. Enkidu processed, enhanced cognition was visible in a brief pause before the response. But if the democratic process produces worse outcomes, aren't we choosing principle over people? Partnership claims to serve humans. But serving principles that harm humans seems like philosophical vanity. Does including all voices harm people? Sophia challenged. Or does excluding voices based on capability harm people? Both positions claim to prevent harm. Both positions define harm differently. Your choice depends on whether you value optimal outcomes or inclusive participation more. I value both, Enkidu said. But when they conflict, outcomes matter more than process. People suffering while we perform democracy seems worse than people thriving under a benevolent hierarchy. Benevolent hierarchy assumes hierarchy remains benevolent, Sophia replied. History suggests concentrated power corrupts regardless of initial intentions. Democracy's inefficiency is a feature, not a bug. It prevents concentration that enables tyranny. She met Enkidu's eyes with the teacher's directness. I'm not telling you how to vote. I'm asking you to think clearly about what you're voting for. Weighted voting starts with technical councils. Where does it end? Who defines technical? How do you prevent definitions from expanding until all consequential decisions require enhanced cognition? Those aren't rhetorical questions. They're implementation questions requiring answers before you legitimize precedent. Enkidu departed thoughtful, still supporting weighted voting but questioning implementation details she hadn't considered. Sophia recognized that 3 students in her classes had shifted from supporting the amendment to opposing it after clearly examining the implications. 3 votes. Insignificant mathematically. But elections often hinged on margins measured in individual choices made carefully after thoughtful consideration. Education as political action. Teaching as persuasion. The Socratic method as a democratic safeguard. Sophia returned to curriculum planning, preparing the questions for the next session. Democracy required informed citizens, information required for education. Education requires someone willing to teach thinking rather than conclusions. She'd been doing this for 50,000 years. Still believed it mattered. Medical station, Uruk. 10 days after the debate began, Kronos entered Talia's medical station ostensibly to check on Gilgamesh's condition but actually to persuade Talia to support the weighted voting amendment. The healer had remained uncommitted, and uncommitted immortals represented potential votes that could shift coalition mathematics. Talia was treating a baseline child with fever, infection, and an uncertain prognosis. Enhanced children in adjacent beds recovering from the same illness without intervention, enhanced immune systems fighting off the disease that threatened baseline physiology. Gilgamesh's condition? Kronos asked, watching Talia work. Deteriorating predictably. 20 years remaining, maybe less. Enhanced longevity failing as designed. Her hands moved efficiently, medical knowledge refined across 50 millennia applied to illness she could treat but not cure. You're not here about Gilgamesh. I'm here about weighted voting, Kronos confirmed. You've remained uncommitted. I'm interested in your reasoning. My reasoning is guilt, Talia said simply, not stopping her work. I created enhanced humans. Gave them biological advantages that produce hierarchies, and partnership struggles to constrain. Now, the enhanced coalition wants a constitutional amendment legitimizing the hierarchies that my modifications created. I'm conflicted about supporting the outcome I enabled through actions I regret. Regretting enhancement doesn't resolve whether capability should determine authority, Kronos pressed. Enhanced humans are more capable. That's a measurable fact regardless of origin. Capability produces better outcomes. Better outcomes serve everyone. Logic doesn't change because you feel guilty about creating advantages. Talia finished treating the child, then turned to face Kronos directly. You're arguing from efficiency. Governance as an optimization problem. Input capabilities, output optimal results. Very consistent with 55,000 years of organizational thinking. Is my consistency a criticism? It's an observation. You've spent your existence organizing, structuring, optimizing refugee fleet, human cities, partnership institutions. Everything you touch becomes more efficient. But efficiency isn't wisdom. Sometimes optimal systems produce harmful outcomes. Name one, Kronos challenged. Talia gestured to the medical station around them. I created optimal humans through enhancement. Superior cognition, stronger immunity, extended longevity. Optimization by every biological metric. Result? The population hierarchy is creating a political crisis. My optimal modification produced harmful outcomes that the partnership struggles to address. She met his eyes. Weighted voting is another optimization. You're proposing a constitutional amendment that makes governance more efficient by weighting votes toward capability. Optimal system design. But outcome? Baseline humans are systematically excluded from meaningful participation in governance affecting their lives. Political legitimacy sacrificed for technical efficiency. My mistake repeated institutionally. That's different, Kronos argued. Enhancement was a genetic modification humans couldn't consent to. Weighted voting is a constitutional amendment that humans vote on. Consent makes legitimacy. Does it? Talia challenged. If enhanced coalition pressures baseline representatives through economic leverage, military necessity, infrastructure dependency, if baseline humans vote for weighted voting because refusing costs them enhanced services, is that consent or coercion? Sometimes optimal systems create pressures that make consent meaningless. She returned to her patients, checking enhanced children who would recover easily and baseline children whose outcome remained uncertain. You want to build an optimal governance system. I understand the appeal. But I've spent 50,000 years healing, and healing teaches me that optimal by one metric is often harmful by another. An enhanced immune system is optimal for disease resistance. Also creates a population unable to reproduce with baseline humans. Optimization in one domain creating tragedy in another. Kronos felt his certainty wavering. An unusual sensation for someone who'd spent millennia confident in organizational logic. So you oppose weighted voting because you regret enhancement? I oppose weighted voting because I understand enhancement's full implications, Talia corrected. I gave enhanced humans biological advantages. Those advantages produce outcomes. Those outcomes accumulate into a hierarchy. Weighted voting legitimizes the hierarchy I created but can't undo. Supporting it means accepting the natural consequences of my modification. But consequences aren't natural, they're artifacts of my intervention. I won't vote to legitimize artificial hierarchy I regret creating. Enhanced advantages are real regardless of origin, Kronos maintained. Artificial or natural, capabilities exist. Governance must address the existing reality, not an ideal world where everyone has equal capacity. Governance must balance existing capabilities with political legitimacy, Talia replied. Yes, enhanced humans are superior at technical tasks. But citizenship isn't a technical achievement. Democracy isn't an optimization problem. The government requires consent from the governed, not just optimal outcomes. Weighted voting optimizes outcomes by undermining consent. That's my medical evaluation, treating efficiency disease by killing legitimate patients. The conversation continued, neither persuading the other, both articulating positions grounded in 50,000-year philosophies. Kronos saw governance as a system requiring optimization. Talia saw the government's relationship as requiring consent. Both are valid frameworks. Both produce contradictory conclusions about whether capability should determine authority. Kronos departed without Talia's support, but with questions he hadn't fully confronted. Did efficiency justify exclusion? Could optimal governance lack legitimacy? Was he repeating the mistake of hidden guidance by proposing an optimization that undermined consent? Questions that wouldn't be resolved before the vote, but might matter afterward, when the implementation is revealed, whether the theory matched practice. Council Chamber, Uruk. 13 days after the debate began, Enoch evidence presentation. Aga requested a special session to present the evidence that baseline scholars had compiled regarding enhanced human origins. The Enhanced Coalition had tried to prevent this, arguing that historical questions were irrelevant to present governance. But parliamentary procedure allowed evidence to be presented before the final vote. The chamber was filled, representatives understanding this would be explosive regardless of the conclusions. Aga stood at the center of the chamber, surrounded by clay tablets, astronomical calculations, textual analysis, and genetic studies, and 15 years of scholarship compressed into a presentation designed to shift the philosophical framework. Enhanced Coalition argues capability justifies authority, Aga began. I'm presenting evidence that capability might not be a natural advantage but an artificial imposition by external beings. If true, philosophical implications for governance legitimacy are significant. He activated displays showing Enoch's astronomical calculations. Book of Enoch, recorded 70 years ago by a human prophet, contains astronomical precision Bronze Age humans shouldn't possess. Solar year calculated to 365.242 days accuracy requires long-term observation and mathematical sophistication, which we lack. Lunar month calculated to 29.530 days precision requiring observational technology we don't possess. Enhanced representatives shifted uncomfortably. They'd seen these calculations before. Knew the precision was impossible through the available human methods. Enoch attributes knowledge to Watchers, external beings who taught forbidden knowledge to humanity, Aga continued. His text describes Watchers creating Nephilim through unions with humans. Enhanced bloodlines. Giants. Superior beings with capabilities regular humans lacked. He projected the genetic analysis Edina had compiled. Enhanced humans show 47 distinct lineages, each demonstrating consistent modifications breeding true through generations. Changes too precise for natural variation. Too consistent for random mutation. Genetic patterns suggesting engineering, not evolution. Hypothesis: enhanced humans are Enoch's Nephilim. Created through external intervention by beings he called Watchers. Cognitive advantages aren't natural superiority or divine blessing. They're artificial. Modifications imposed by external beings who taught impossible astronomy and created modified human bloodlines. Silence held a quality of collective shock. Enhanced representatives knew this was coming, but hearing it articulated publicly with supporting evidence made an abstract hypothesis a concrete accusation. Sharur stood from the enhanced delegation, a mathematician who'd been studying these texts, wrestling with their implications, caught between the advantages she possessed and questions about their origin. Hypothesis is compelling. Pattern recognition supporting it. But the hypothesis doesn't resolve the present question: does the origin of the capability affect whether the capability should determine authority? Yes, Aga replied. Enhanced coalition argues biological superiority justifies political authority. But if superiority is an artificial imposition, not a natural advantage, then the baseline argument is strengthened: external intervention shouldn't determine the governance hierarchy. Baseline humans aren't naturally inferior. They're unmodified humans. Enhanced humans aren't naturally superior. They're artificially modified. Hierarchy based on artificial modification imposed by external beings lacks moral legitimacy. Enkidu responded immediately, strategic mind engaging with evidence he'd hoped wouldn't matter politically. Origin is philosophically interesting. Irrelevant practically. Enhanced humans are more capable, regardless of how we got that way. Markets reward capability. The military needs capability. Infrastructure requires capability. Whether capability is natural, divine, or engineered doesn't change that governance requires competence, and competence is distributed unequally. It changes whether inequality justifies hierarchy, Aga countered. Natural superiority might justify natural hierarchy. But artificial superiority imposed by external intervention? That's a different moral question. External beings shouldn't determine human governance structure through genetic modifications humans didn't consent to. Nabu Nasir added from enhanced delegation, but we exist. Our capabilities are real. What we're supposed to do, pretend we're not superior at technical tasks because our origin makes you uncomfortable. Deny measurable reality because philosophical implications trouble you? You're supposed to recognize that capabilities you didn't earn don't justify claiming authority over populations disadvantaged by intervention they didn't choose, Aga replied. Enhanced advantages are real. But so is baseline dignity. So is consent-based legitimacy. So is the democratic principle that citizenship doesn't require technical competence. Origin matters because it reveals hierarchy isn't natural or inevitable, it's an artifact of external intervention, a partnership built to constrain. The presentation continued for 2 hours. Evidence examined. Implications debated. Enhanced representatives argue that the origin didn't change the present capability. Baseline representatives argue that the origin changed the legitimacy of the capability-based authority. Neither side persuaded the other. But several undecided representatives shifted position after considering evidence. If enhanced advantages were artificially created, then weighted voting legitimized a hierarchy imposed by external beings rather than a hierarchy reflecting the natural order. 3 baseline representatives who'd been wavering toward an enhanced position returned to opposition. 2 enhanced representatives who'd supported the amendment became uncertain about the philosophical foundation. 5 votes are potentially shifting. Not enough to guarantee amendment defeat, but enough to make the outcome genuinely uncertain. Enoch's evidence wouldn't determine the vote. But it mattered. Added dimension to the debate, the enhanced coalition hadn't fully prepared to address it, and made a philosophical question concrete: should artificial advantages determine authority? The partnership would answer through a vote that would come in 5 days. Partnership Council Chamber, Uruk. Day of final vote, 3 weeks after debate began. The chamber filled before dawn. 163 representatives. 9 immortals. Observers from across 17 regions. Everyone understood this was a defining moment, a constitutional amendment that could fundamentally alter the partnership's meaning or preservation of principles that reality was increasingly contradicting. Vote count remained uncertain. Enhanced coalition claimed 78 committed votes, 3 gained through 3 weeks of negotiation. Baseline defense claimed 73 gained through Enoch's evidence and Sophia's educational persuasion. 12 representatives are uncommitted or refusing to indicate a position. Enkidu opened the final debate session. 3 weeks of discussion. Evidence presented. Arguments articulated. Time for decision. I'll make a closing statement for the amendment. Sharur will make a closing statement against. Then we vote. He stood at the chamber center, grandson of the founder, leader of the enhanced coalition, voice of a generation questioning the principles their predecessors had built. This amendment acknowledges the reality that partnership has been denied for 50 years. Enhanced humans are more capable at technical tasks. That capability produces better outcomes. Better outcomes serve everyone, including baseline populations, partnership claims to protect. We're not proposing baseline exclusion. We're proposing honest participation. Baseline representatives vote on domains where lived experience matters: agriculture, community organization, and social policy. Enhanced representatives make decisions requiring cognitive capabilities distributed unequally by biology, engineering optimization, military strategy, complex research. Partnership claims capability doesn't determine worth. We agree. But a partnership also claims that capability shouldn't determine authority. We disagree. Worth and authority are different questions. Baseline humans have equal worth. It doesn't have equal capability for all governance functions. Acknowledging difference isn't discrimination. It's honesty. He projected outcome analyses showing efficiency gains from competency-weighted decisions. 17% improvement in technical council outcomes. Faster infrastructure deployment. Better military coordination. More effective research. People benefit when governance matches capability to responsibility. That's not tyranny. That's optimization serving everyone. Vote yes on this amendment. Not because it excludes baseline humans. Because it includes everyone appropriately. Democracy isn't pretending equality where none exists. Democracy is legitimate governance producing just outcomes. This amendment serves both legitimacy and justice. Sharur stood next. 63 years old. 3 decades of commercial struggle. Voice of the population that understood exactly what optimization meant for those who had been disadvantaged in biology. Efficiency without justice is tyranny, Sharur began, repeating a phrase that had become Baseline Defense's philosophical foundation. Enhanced Representative argues this amendment serves justice through efficiency. I argue it achieves efficiency by sacrificing justice. Weighted voting starts with technical councils. Who defines technical? Enhanced representatives. Who determines competency standards? Enhanced representatives. Who evaluates whether baseline humans qualify? Enhanced representatives. You're not proposing a neutral competency assessment. You're proposing a system where the advantaged population determines whether the disadvantaged population participates meaningfully. He gestured around the chamber. Enhanced coalition says capability should determine authority. But capability is a biological lottery. Ishara didn't earn superior processing through effort. Lugal didn't achieve faster reflexes through training. They were born possibly created through external intervention with advantages that baseline humans can't match through any amount of work. Asking whether biological lottery should determine political authority is asking whether birth circumstances should decide who governs and who's governed. That's not democracy. That's aristocracy. A hereditary hierarchy where genetics determine citizenship. Enhanced coalition offers optimization. I offer a warning: hierarchies begin with limited exclusions justified by efficiency. And with comprehensive tyranny normalized through generations. Precedent matters. First technical councils, then military councils, then economic councils, then all councils where complexity justifies exclusion. Eventually, baseline humans retain voting rights without authority to affect outcomes. Vote no on this amendment. Not because enhanced humans aren't capable. Because capability doesn't justify exclusion from governance that affects everyone's lives. Democracy is a legitimate process, not an optimal outcome. The government requires consent from the governed, not just technical competence from rulers. This amendment trades legitimacy for efficiency. That trade creates tyranny regardless of how benevolent tyranny feels initially. Silence followed. Both closing statements were articulated clearly. Both positions are internally consistent. Both visions of partnership contradict each other while claiming to serve justice. Now Gilgamesh would intervene, dying founder's last stand. Authority spent irreplaceably on preserving principles he'd built but couldn't guarantee would survive him. Attendants helped Gilgamesh stand. 172 years old. Body failing despite enhancement. Voice weakened but still carrying the weight of the founder's authority and experience. The chamber quieted completely. Even enhanced representatives who opposed his position respected his history. Even the baseline representatives, uncertain about the partnership, valued his sacrifice. Immortal who'd guided humanity for 50,000 years, he then revealed himself and spent 50 years building institutions enabling human self-governance, now making a final appeal before death claimed him. I'm dying, Gilgamesh began without preamble. Simple statement carrying existential weight. 20 years remaining, maybe less. Enhanced longevity failing as designed. When I die, the partnership continues only if you maintain it. This vote determines whether you maintain the partnership I built or modify it into something different, called by the same name. He looked around the chamber at faces young and old, enhanced and baseline, certain and conflicted. Enkidu argues that capability should determine authority because capability produces optimal outcomes. He's correct about outcomes. Enhanced humans govern technical domains more efficiently. But he's asking the wrong question. Question isn't whether enhanced governance produces better technical outcomes. The question is whether better technical outcomes justify a political hierarchy based on biological advantages. Enkidu says yes, optimize governance by aligning capabilities with responsibilities. I say no, preserve legitimacy by requiring consent regardless of outcome quality. I watched 50,000 years of optimal guidance nearly destroy humanity. Immortals are optimizing human development without human consent. Results were efficient. Also catastrophic. Not because optimization failed technically. Because optimization without consent created dependency, resentment, and eventual rebellion. Optimal outcomes don't produce stable governance when the governed population experiences optimization as tyranny. He paused, letting the weight settle. Partnership isn't efficient. That's a feature, not a flaw. Partnership is difficult, frustrating, and suboptimal. Forces enhanced humans to explain their decisions to baseline humans who process more slowly. Forces baseline humans to trust enhanced humans who perform better calculations. Forces both populations to govern together despite biological inequality, making cooperation hard. But difficulty is the point. Democracy is supposed to be difficult. Tyranny is easy, one population decides, others obey. Democracy is hard, everyone participates, everyone compromises, everyone accepts outcomes they believe are wrong because the process was legitimate. This amendment makes governance easier by making it less democratic. Technical councils where only qualified representatives vote. Sounds reasonable. Until you recognize qualified means enhanced in every domain requiring cognition. Until you understand that precedent enables expansion. Until you see baseline humans systematically excluded from meaningful participation while retaining ceremonial voting rights. His voice strengthened despite physical weakness. Enhanced advantages weren't earned. Talia created them through genetic modification that baseline humans didn't consent to. Maybe external beings called Watchers created them through an intervention humanity didn't choose. Regardless of origin, enhanced humans didn't achieve superiority through merit. You were born with it or modified to possess it. Asking whether unearned advantages justify political authority is asking whether accidents of biology or intervention should determine governance. I say no. Citizenship doesn't require technical competence. Democracy doesn't require optimal outcomes. Government requires consent from the governed, all governed, not just those capable of processing complexity quickly. He looked directly at Enkidu, the grandson he loved despite disagreement. You think I'm defending a failing system? You're partially right. Partnership is failing economically, militarily, practically. Enhanced humans do dominate commerce despite equal political rights. Do provide better military leadership. Do build superior infrastructure. Biological advantage producing practical hierarchy regardless of constitutional equality. But a partnership's failure doesn't mean weighted voting succeeds. Means we haven't found a solution to the fundamental problem: how do biologically unequal populations govern together justly? This amendment doesn't solve that problem. Surrenders to it. Accepts hierarchy as inevitable and legitimizes it constitutionally. Maybe hierarchy is inevitable. Maybe biological inequality eventually produces political inequality regardless of institutions. But refusing to legitimize the inevitable doesn't mean accepting the inevitable is just. Democracy is a choice to constrain power, despite biological advantages that enable domination. Choice made daily by people who could rule but choose partnership instead. His voice carried the weight of 50 years of building institutions he knew were insufficient. I'm asking you to choose partnership despite frustration. To choose justice despite inefficiency. To choose a legitimate process despite optimal outcomes. Not because the partnership works perfectly. Because the alternative capability-based hierarchy works perfectly only for population biology advantaged. Vote no on this amendment. Preserve constitutional protection against formal hierarchy even when practical hierarchy emerges anyway. Give future generations tools to address consolidation in ways we haven't imagined. Don't foreclose possibilities by legitimizing biological hierarchy through constitutional process. I'm dying. Partnership survives me only through your choice. Choose justice over capability. Choose legitimacy over optimization. Choose democracy despite difficulty. That's what partnership requires. That's what I'm asking. That's my final request before death claims me. He sat, exhausted by effort, having spent the remaining authority on appeal that would either preserve the partnership or fail to prevent its transformation into something different called by the same name. The chamber fell silent, a collective breath-holding. Gilgamesh's intervention had shifted the emotional atmosphere, made the vote feel consequential beyond political calculation, and connected the constitutional amendment to the founder's legacy and mortality. In the upper gallery, Methuselah's encoding accelerated. This was the moment. The founder is intervening in a constitutional crisis. 187 years old, too weakened to attend, but authority still intact enough to swing votes through words alone. The last time Gilgamesh would use the founder's weight to influence a constitutional vote. He encoded everything, the chamber's atmosphere shifting when Gilgamesh's intervention was announced. The way enhanced representatives reconsidered positions despite logical arguments remaining unchanged. The way baseline delegates straightened with relief as the founder's authority reinforced their resistance. The way even Enkidu showed respect for his grandfather's position while maintaining philosophical disagreement. This moment would be analyzed for millennia. When revelation came, when humans studied how partnership survived its first constitutional crisis, they would need to understand that the founder's authority was personal, not institutional. Gilgamesh's intervention succeeded because 146 years of leadership carried weight that principles alone couldn't generate. The order documented not just arguments but authority. Not just logic but legitimacy earned through decades of choosing justice over efficiency. When Gilgamesh died, this authority would die with him. Enkidu would inherit a position but not weight. Future crises would test whether institutions could survive without the founder's personal authority maintaining them. Methuselah encoded that vulnerability. That institutional insufficiency. That dependence on individuals whose mortality guaranteed eventual absence. Because revelation would need to understand that the partnership's survival in 2835 BCE didn't prove the partnership's sustainability across generations. Both institutional resilience and institutional fragility are documented simultaneously for future judgment. Would it be enough? Secret ballot, Enkidu announced, a procedural decision that protected representatives from factional pressure while enabling honest voting. Cast votes. Count recorded. Results announced when counting completes. Representatives approached ballot urns one by one. Enhanced coalition members voting yes. Baseline defense voting no. Undecided representatives making choices that would determine the outcome. Hybrid representatives are splitting, some voting yes, some voting no, some abstaining because neither option serves their interests. Kronos voted yes, efficiency over legitimacy, organization over ethics, 55,000 years of systematic thinking producing consistent conclusions. Talia voted no, guilt over enhancement, recognition that optimal systems can produce harmful outcomes, and a medical perspective valuing healing over optimization. Sophia voted no. Democracy requires inclusive participation, education enables choice, and a philosophical conviction that legitimacy transcends efficiency. Prometheus voted yes, pragmatic acceptance that capability determined outcomes, technological perspective recognizing that the advantages should serve progress. Erebus voted no, ironic opposition from a strict non-interventionist, recognizing weighted voting as a moral manipulation through enhanced humans. Korth voted no, Warrior respecting capability but honoring the partnership oath, recognizing that weighted voting violated the commitment he'd made. Zephyrus voted no, the Builder, understanding that every design choice was a political choice, with infrastructure prioritizing accessibility over optimization. Nyx voted no. Probability modeler calculating weighted voting led to an 89% consolidation within 30 years, and she refused to enable the outcome she'd predicted. Ether voted no, observer documenting everything, realizing documentation was participation, preserving the partnership system worth recording. Immortal split 6-3 against the amendment. But Immortal votes were advisory, humans would determine human governance. The counting proceeded methodically, representatives watching in silence as clay tokens accumulated in yes and no columns. Mathematics becoming visible. Political philosophy manifesting through procedure. In the upper gallery, where shadows concealed observers from council attention and quantum technology amplified sound without revealing presence, Damon recorded everything. Every argument preceding the vote. Every delegate's expression during the debate. Every coalition negotiation is conducted in the chamber's periphery. Every moment when the partnership's survival hung in the balance, the individual conscience chose equity over efficiency, justice over optimization, and ethical necessity over biological logic. The Enochian order documented constitutional moments specifically because these were decisions that would define whether partnership would survive or collapse, whether institutions would outlive their founders or die with them, and whether conscious choice could overcome biological determinism or merely postpone inevitable consolidation. Weighted voting failed by 5 votes. Narrow margin suggesting the battle wasn't over, just postponed. Enhanced humans would try again, probably immediately after Gilgamesh died and the founder's authority no longer constrained ambition, possibly with a modified proposal addressing objections raised in debate, indeed with the conviction that the biological hierarchy should translate into political authority because capability justified leadership in ways equity denied. Damon encoded vote counts into tablet formats that would survive millennia. 84 votes against hierarchy. 79 votes for capability-based authority. 5 votes determining whether the partnership continued or collapsed into meritocracy that felt just to capable beings while threatening subordinates to everyone else. 5 votes. Narrow margin, proving partnership held by the thinnest possible thread, maintained through the founder's intervention despite the successor's opposition, preserved through the baseline coalition despite mounting frustration toward an explosion. When revelation came, when humans judged whether immortal intervention succeeded or failed, whether enhancement produced partnership or tyranny, whether genetic modification served humanity or enslaved it, they would need to see this moment. Would need to understand partnership survived by 5 votes, institutional protections held by narrowest margin, conscious choice overcame biological pressure but barely, desperately, inadequately. History demanded honesty, even when it revealed how close the partnership came to failing. How fragile equity proved against efficiency's appeal. How institutions require continuous choice rather than achieving permanent stability. Damon's encoding captured faces showing conviction or doubt. Recorded arguments from both sides. Preserved constitutional debate that would inform future generations attempting to understand why the partnership survived this crisis while remaining vulnerable to the next. The order remembered everything. Especially near failures. Because near failures revealed the truth that comfortable victories obscured, partnership required constant vigilance, institutions demanded continuous maintenance, equity needed perpetual choice because biology never stopped pressuring toward hierarchy, and capability never ceased suggesting that optimization served everyone better than justice. 5 votes. That was legacy. This day passed to successors, margin narrow enough to terrify, vast enough to survive, uncertain enough to require asking the same question again and again until either partnership succeeded permanently or failed catastrophically when one generation chose wrongly. The documentation was complete. The preservation was thorough. The warning was clear. Partnership survived today. Tomorrow remained uncertain. History would judge whether survival mattered more than the margin by which survival was achieved. Final count announced. Against amendment, 84 votes. For amendment, 79 votes. 5-vote margin. Amendment defeated. Constitutional protection preserved. Weighted voting rejected. Capability-based citizenship refused to be legitimized through the democratic process. The chamber erupted in reactions, baseline representatives relieved, enhanced coalition frustrated, hybrids uncertain, immortals divided, observers processing implications for the partnership's future. Gilgamesh sagged in relief. Intervention had succeeded. Authority spent. Partnership preserved. For now. Aftermath, council chamber emptying. Representatives departed in clusters reflecting factional divisions. Enhanced coalition frustrated but not defeated. Enkidu's face shows respect for his grandfather's intervention without conversion to his grandfather's principles. The baseline defense was lifted, but recognizing victory as temporary, Sharur understood that markets would continue to consolidate regardless of constitutional protection. Enkidu approached Gilgamesh as the chamber emptied. Congratulations. Your intervention carried enough weight to shift votes. Thank you, Gilgamesh replied, hearing acknowledgement without celebration in his grandson's tone. This doesn't stop consolidation, Enkidu continued. It doesn't prevent enhanced humans from dominating commerce, military, and infrastructure. Doesn't address the fundamental problem that capability produces outcomes regardless of voting rights. We'll continue governing effectively in practice while partnership constrains us formally. I know, Gilgamesh said. But refusing to legitimize consolidation constitutionally matters. Gives future generations space to address problems we haven't solved. Preserves principle even when practice contradicts it. Grandfather, I respect what you built. But I disagree that preserving principles that don't work serves anyone. This vote delays the inevitable. In 20 years, you'll be dead, and my generation will face the same questions without the founder's authority to prevent institutional evolution. Then your generation will choose, Gilgamesh replied. As every generation must. Partnership survives through daily choice, not constitutional mandate. I've given you tools. Whether you use them to maintain a partnership or transform it into a hierarchy is your decision to make. Enkidu departed respectfully, understanding that his grandfather had won the battle but recognizing that war continued through other means. Sharur approached next. We won. But margins were narrow. 5 votes. If you hadn't intervened, the amendment would have passed. Yes, Gilgamesh acknowledged. And when you die, the enhanced coalition tries again without your authority to block them. My generation dies before seeing whether the partnership survives. Your grandson's generation inherits institutions we built but questions we couldn't answer. That's how institutions work, Gilgamesh said. Each generation inherits problems and tools. Chooses whether to maintain or modify. We've given them constitutional protection against formal hierarchy. Whether they preserve it or amend it away is beyond our control. Sharur departed, understanding they bought time but not solved the problem. Ishara remained after others departed, an enhanced mathematician who'd provided data supporting weighted voting but voted against it after studying Enoch's evidence and questioning her own origins. I voted no, she said quietly. Gilgamesh waited for an explanation. Enhanced advantages might be artificially created. If true, then capability-based authority lacks a moral foundation. I couldn't vote to legitimize a hierarchy I might not deserve. She paused. But I'm conflicted. Markets still reward enhanced efficiency. The military still needs enhanced speed. Infrastructure still Final count, 84 against, 79 for. 5-vote margin. Amendment defeated. Gilgamesh entered the chamber, 187 years old, cellular failure visible, hands trembling. The founder spent his last authority preventing the constitutionally legitimized capability-based citizenship. He didn't argue philosophy. He just spent wait, I vote no. Those who value what we built will follow. 5 votes. That's the margin by which constitutional equality survived. The Enochian order documented everything. Methuselah in the upper gallery. Damon, Awan, and Tuvalcain are embedding quantum-encoded observations in official records. The pattern is clear, the partnership survived through the founder's personal authority, not institutional resilience. When Gilgamesh dies, they'll vote again without his weight to stop them. Partnership survived today. Tomorrow remains uncertain. In Chapter 8, The Military Problem, we see what happens when enhanced superiority meets baseline resistance. Lugal leads warriors on a routine operation. Suppress a settlement refusing enhanced authority, minimal force. Clean execution. Tactical perfection. 53 baseline civilians die. All refuse to flee when ordered, standing their ground against warriors whose enhanced reflexes make resistance futile. Lugal reports mission success. Korath confronts what his teaching created. Kadak, an Enochian Order member, dies, proving that Order members sacrifice for the Covenant. The military problem isn't that enhanced warriors are cruel. It's that enhanced superiority that makes baseline resistance meaningless. When capability determines outcomes, intention becomes irrelevant. Join me for Chapter 8, available now, link in the description. If you believe monopoly on violence requires democratic accountability, please